I have been awake since 1:47 in the morning. The weather mast alarm went off at that exact time. A sharp, electronic chirp from the console in the kitchen that cuts through the low hum of the radio and the settling of the wood stove. It is an alarm triggered by wind speed anomalies, designed to wake me if a squall line hits the ridge hard enough to threaten the antenna array. I got out of bed, pulled my wool sweater over my head, and walked into the kitchen in my socks. The floorboards were cold. The station was dark, except for the amber glow of the indoor weather display and the green standby light on the radio. I stood in front of the display and checked the readings. Wind speed, 0 miles per hour. Wind direction, null. Temperature, 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure, steady. I looked out the kitchen window. The glass was cold against my forehead. Outside, the air was perfectly, absolutely still. The subalpine firs at the edge of the clearing were not moving. The dust on the fire road was undisturbed. The anemometer cups on the mast, 50 yards out in the dark, were not turning. There was no wind. There had been no wind for 3 days. I watched the mast for a full minute. The alarm chirped again, a secondary warning indicating a sustained gust event. The digital readout on the console flickered, updating the peak gust to 34 miles per hour. I looked back out the window. The cups remained still. The trees remained still. The mountain was holding its breath. I went back to the console, pressed the silence button to stop the chirping, and opened the physical logbook. I wrote the time. I wrote the instrument readings. I wrote that the alarm had activated, and the physical environment showed no corresponding wind event. I closed the book. I went back to bed. This is a normal night at Harrow Peak in the second month of my posting. I want to establish that clearly, because the things that happen at this station only feel strange if you expect the mountain to behave like the places you are used to. Harrow Peak is not a place that behaves. It is a place that operates. And if you want to stay here, you have to learn the difference. To understand why I was sitting in the dark, watching a weather display, you need to understand how I got to Harrow Peak, and what was read to me on my first night. I arrived in late September. The hiring was expedited, which was unusual for a late-season backcountry posting. But I was between assignments in Wyoming, and the district office offered me the rotation. I drove up the 12-mile fire road in the fading afternoon light. The road is steep, heavily graded, and switchbacks constantly through dense stands of lodgepole and whitebark pine. By the time I reached the station at 7,100 feet, the sun was dropping behind the western ridge, and the temperature was falling fast. Harrow Peak Ranger Station is a 2-room building with a kitchen common area, a small sleeping room, a covered utility porch, and a detached equipment shed. It sits on a south-facing bench. Directly to the north, rising sharply above the tree line, is Harrow Peak itself, a 9,400-foot summit of gray rock and permanent snow. When I pulled into the gravel lot, the summit was still catching the last direct sunlight, glowing a pale, bruised purple, while the station was already in deep shadow. Ket was waiting for me on the utility porch. He was a senior ranger, late 50s, built like a fire hydrant, with a face that looked like it had been left out in the weather too long. He didn't offer to help me unload my truck. He just pointed to the door, told me my gear could go in the sleeping room, and said we needed to go over the station protocols before he drove back down the mountain. The inside of the station smelled of diesel exhaust, old wood smoke, and something else, something faintly mineral. Like wet stone and cold iron, I dropped my duffel bag in the sleeping room and came back to the kitchen. Kat was sitting at the small wooden table under the overhead light. There was a pot of coffee on the stove, already brewed. He poured 2 mugs and slid one across the table toward me. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded into quarters. He unfolded it, smoothed it flat on the table, and looked at me. "I'm going to read you the night protocols for this station," he said. His voice was flat, unhurried. He didn't look at me while he spoke. He looked at the paper. You don't get a copy. You listen, and you memorize. If you write them down, you'll rely on the paper. If you rely on the paper, you'll lose the paper, and then you'll be a problem. I took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter and too hot. I nodded. He began to read. Rule 1. After sundown, do not leave the station on foot for any reason. If you must check the fuel depot or the equipment shed, drive the truck. Do not walk between buildings in the dark. Rule 2. The fire road gates are locked at dusk. If you arrive at a gate after dark and find it unlocked, do not open it further. Return to the station and note the gate number and the time. Do not attempt to relock it until morning. Rule 3. If the weather mast alarm activates between midnight and 4 in the morning, check the instrument readings from the indoor display only. Do not go outside to inspect the mast until after first light. Rule 4. If the radio produces a voice that does not identify itself with the correct district call sign, do not respond. Log the time and the content of the transmission if you can. Do not engage. Rule 5. If you see a light on the Harrow North route after dark, do not investigate. Do not use your own light to signal toward it. Confirm the trail gate is locked from the station window and stay inside. Rule 6. If someone knocks on the station door after 10 p.m., do not open it. Ask them to identify themselves and their emergency through the door. If they cannot state a specific emergency, tell them to wait at the fire ring and that you will assist them at first light. Do not open the door, regardless of what they say next. Rule 7. If the temperature inside the station drops more than 15 degrees in under 30 minutes after midnight, do not attempt to locate the source of the draft. Bank the stove, put on your gear, and sit in the center of the kitchen until the temperature stabilizes. Do not go to the windows. Rule 8. In the morning log, record only what you directly observed. Do not record inferences, interpretations, or questions. If you are uncertain what you observed, write nothing and wait for clarity. The log is not a place for uncertainty. He finished reading. He folded the paper back into quarters, slid it into his shirt pocket, and stood up. Any questions? He asked. Can I at least see the list one more time? I asked, just to make sure I got the phrasing right. You'll learn them better this way, he said. He walked to the door, pulled his jacket tight, and stepped out onto the porch. Generator fuel is topped off. Propane is at 80%. District repeater Comes in clear on Channel 4. I'll be down at the ranch for the weekend. Radio check at 0800 and 2000. Don't burn the place down." He walked out to his truck. I followed him to the porch. He got in, started the engine, and backed out of the lot. I stood on the utility porch and watched his taillights bounce down the fire road until they disappeared around the first switchback. Then I went back inside, locked the door, sat down at the kitchen table, and took out my notebook. I wrote down what I remembered. I got 6 of the rules. I was fairly confident about the wording on 5 of them, but I knew, with a quiet, sinking certainty, that I was missing something. I couldn't tell which 2 I had forgotten, or if the phrasing on the others was slightly off. I stared at the page for a long time. The station was completely silent. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen window. I closed the notebook. I didn't know it yet, but I didn't need to worry about the missing rules. The mountain would provide the rest of them, in the order they needed to be learned. The first rule proved itself in my first week. It was a routine check. The fuel depot sat about 30 yards behind the station, consisting of 2 large propane tanks and a blue diesel drum for the generator. District protocol required a visual check of the tank levels and the pressure valves every 3 days. I had been doing it in the late afternoon, while there was still daylight. On Thursday, I got delayed. A weather system was moving in from the west, and I spent an extra hour on the radio, coordinating with the district meteorologist. By the time I signed off, the sun was gone. The sky was a deep, bruised blue, and the shadows from the firs were stretching long and black across the clearing. It was nearly dark. I grabbed my jacket and reached for my flashlight. I was going to walk out to the depot, check the gauges, and walk back. It was a 30-yard walk. I had done it a dozen times in the daylight. My hand was on the doorknob when I stopped. After sundown, do not leave the station on foot for any reason. If you must check the fuel depot or the equipment shed, drive the truck. Do not walk between buildings in the dark. I stood in the kitchen, my hand on the brass knob, feeling faintly ridiculous. I am a backcountry ranger. I have spent nights in snow caves and solo in fire lookouts. The idea that I couldn't walk 30 yards in the dark to check a propane gauge felt like an insult to my competence. But the rule was specific, and Ket had been specific about not having a copy to check. If I walked out there and something happened, I wouldn't know if I was just being paranoid or if I was violating a protocol designed to keep me alive. I let go of the doorknob. I walked out to the utility porch, got into the patrol truck, and started the engine. I backed out of the lot, drove the 30 yards to the fuel depot, and parked. I got out with my flashlight, checked the gauges, both at 80%, pressure normal, got back in the truck, and drove back to the station. I locked the door, went into the kitchen, and made a cup of instant coffee. I felt silly. I told myself it was just Ket being overly cautious, a senior ranger trying to instill discipline in a new guy by making him drive for things he could walk to. The next morning, I woke up early and walked out to the fuel depot on foot, in the bright, clear daylight, to double-check the gauges myself. The ground between the station and the depot was covered in a light, crisp layer of morning frost. The short-cropped mountain grass was white. But as I walked, I noticed something wrong with the frost pattern. There was a corridor. It was about 3 feet wide, running in a straight line from the utility porch to the fuel depot. Inside that corridor, the frost was broken. The grass blades were bent flat, pressed into the dirt. It wasn't a trail of footprints. There were no distinct heel or toe impressions. It looked more like the grass had been pressed down by something heavy, wide, and continuous. Something that had dragged itself, or glided, or walked with a stride too long and too smooth to leave distinct tracks. I stood at the edge of the corridor and looked back at the station. The distance was exactly 30 yards. The corridor didn't wander. It didn't stop. It went in a perfectly straight line from my back door to the propane tanks. I looked around the rest of the clearing. The frost was undisturbed everywhere else. No deer tracks, no coyote prints, no bird tracks. Just this single, smooth, pressed corridor in the frost. I walked back to the station. I went into the kitchen, opened the physical logbook, and wrote, 7:15 hours. Ground disturbance, possible wildlife activity, south perimeter between station and fuel depot. Frost pattern displaced in a continuous corridor. No distinct tracks identified. I did not write that it looked like something had walked from my door to the propane tanks in the dark. I did not write that I was glad I had driven the truck. I just wrote the facts. I closed the book. I drank my coffee. I went out and did my morning weather checks. That was the first time I understood that the rules were not suggestions. They were boundaries. And I had just seen what happens when you don't cross them. The second rule tested me 3 weeks later. There are 3 locked trail gates on the access roads around Harrow Peak. Gate 1 is on the main fire road, 2 miles south of the station. Gate 2 is on the east access road, about 4 miles out. Gate 3 is on the north road, which runs toward the junction of the Harrow North Route. I was required to do a weekly visual check on all 3 gates to ensure the locks were secure and the chains were intact. I did my gate checks on Tuesdays. In late October, the days were getting short, and I was running behind schedule. I had spent the afternoon repairing a section of washed-out road near the east boundary, and by the time I finished, the light was failing. I got in the truck and started driving the loop. Gate 1 was locked. The padlock was secure, the chain tight. Gate 2 was locked. Same. I drove north toward Gate 3. The sun was completely down by the time I reached it. The headlights of the truck cut through the dark, illuminating the heavy steel gate and the thick chain wrapped around the posts. I stopped the truck and put it in park. I kept the engine running and the headlights on. The padlock was hanging open. The shackle was disengaged from the hasp. The lock was dangling by its body, swinging slightly in the cold breeze coming off the peak. The chain was loose, the ends resting on the gravel. The gate itself was still closed, pushed firmly against the stops, but it was unsecured. I sat in the truck and stared at it. The heater was blowing warm air against my legs. The radio was playing low, a static-laced broadcast of a county weather report from a station 40 miles south. If you arrive at a gate after dark and find it unlocked, do not open it further. Return to the station and note the gate number and the time. Do not attempt to relock it until morning. I looked at the padlock. It was a standard district master lock. I had the key on my belt ring. I could get out of the truck, walk to the gate, snap the shackle back into the hasp, and lock it. It would take 10 seconds. It was my job to secure the gates. Leaving it unlocked felt like a dereliction of duty. But the rule was absolute. Do not attempt to relock it until morning. I put the truck in drive. I turned around. I drove back to the station. When I got inside, I opened the logbook. I wrote, 18:23 hours. Gate 3. Lock found disengaged. Gate position maintained. Did not relock. Will address at first light. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the gate. I kept thinking about the chain hanging loose in the dark. If someone or something wanted to come down the north road, the gate was open. The rule said not to relock it. Why? What was the point of leaving a gate unlocked if not to let something through? At first light, I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and drove back out to Gate 3. The morning was crisp and bright. The frost was still on the grass. I pulled up to the gate. I turned off the engine and got out. Padlock was locked. I walked up to it. I grabbed the shackle and pulled. It was solid. It was locked tight. I pulled my district key off my belt ring, slid it into the keyway, and turned it. The lock clicked open. I stood there, holding the open lock, looking at the chain, looking at the gate. I checked the hasp. I checked the lock body. It was my lock. It was the district lock, the one that only the district office and the stationed ranger had keys to. I hadn't locked it. No one else had a key. The gate had been unlocked at 6 p.m. and locked at 6 a.m. in a station that was 22 miles from the nearest paved road, in a forest that had been empty of human activity for a month. I locked the gate, got back in the truck, and drove to the station. I went into the kitchen. I opened the logbook. I looked at the blank page for the morning. In the morning log, record only what you directly observed. Do not record inferences, interpretations, or questions. I picked up my pen. I wrote, 6:15 hours, Gate 3, lock found secured, verified with district key. I didn't write that it had locked itself. I didn't write that I was terrified. I just wrote what I could prove. I closed the book. I made my coffee. I went out and started the generator. The third rule was the one I mentioned at the beginning, the weather mast alarm. I had been at the station 6 weeks when it happened. The mast is a 30-foot steel tower mounted on a concrete pad 50 yards east of the station. It holds the anemometer, the wind vane, the temperature probe, and the barometric sensor. It's wired directly to the console in the kitchen. At 1:47 a.m., the alarm chirped. I went into the kitchen, checked the display. Wind, 0. Temperature, 31. Pressure, steady. I looked out the window. The mast was still. The cups weren't moving. I watched it for a minute. The alarm chirped again. The digital readout updated. Peak gust, 34 miles per hour. Duration, 11 seconds. I looked back out the window. Nothing was moving. The air was dead calm. I went back to the console, silenced the alarm, and logged the event. I wrote the time, the instrument readings, and the physical observation of the mast. I didn't write that the mountain was breathing. I didn't write that the sensors were measuring something that wasn't wind. I just wrote the facts. The next morning, I pulled the data card from the outdoor mast housing and loaded it into the kitchen computer. I looked at the graph for the night. At 1:47 a.m., there was a massive, jagged spike in the wind speed data. A perfect, clean bell curve peaking at 34 miles per hour, lasting exactly 11 seconds, and dropping back to 0. I checked the data from the nearest automated weather station, 40 miles south in the valley. Their graph for the same time period was a flat, dead line, 0 wind. The anemometer at Harrow Peak was functioning correctly. I had tested it myself. The cups spun freely. The sensor was calibrated. The hardware was recording a physical force. But there was no force there. I sat in the kitchen and looked at the graph. I thought about the frost corridor behind the station. I thought about the locked gate. I thought about the things that happen when you don't look out the window. I closed the laptop. I went outside and did my morning checks. I didn't mention the ghost gust in my report to the district. I just logged it in the physical book as the rule required. The midpoint of my season came in early November, during a deep cleaning day. The station needed to be winterized. I was moving furniture, checking the seals on the windows, pulling the kitchen stove away from the wall to clean behind it. When I pulled the heavy iron stove away from the cinder block wall, I saw something wedged in the gap between the wall and the old cast iron radiator. It was a small, black, leather-bound notebook. I reached behind the radiator and pulled it out. The cover was cracked and dusty. I opened it. On the inside cover, written in blue ink, was a name, Prewitt. I didn't recognize the name. I had asked the district coordinator about the station's history when I took the job, and she told me I was the third ranger in the past decade. The other two had transferred or left the service. I assumed Prewitt was one of them. I sat on the kitchen floor and read the notebook. It wasn't an official log. It was a personal journal. The handwriting was cramped, hurried, the letters slanting sharply to the right. The first half of the notebook was mundane. Prewitt wrote about the weather, the wildlife, the repairs he was making to the station. He wrote about missing his wife, about the quality of the instant coffee, about the way the light hit the peak at sunset. But in the final third of the notebook, the tone changed. The entries became shorter. The handwriting became more erratic. October 12th. Mast alarm again at 0200. No wind. Logged it. October 15th. Gate 2 was open this morning. I locked it. Found it open again at dusk. Didn't touch it. Drove back. October 19th. Ket read me the list on my first night, too. I think the list is the same list every time. I think Ket has had it for a long time. I stopped reading. I stared at the page. Ket read me the list on my first night, too. I turned the page. There was a blank page. And then, on the next page, a single line of text. The handwriting was pressed so hard into the paper, it had nearly torn through. I went to the window during the temperature drop, and I saw. The line ended there. The pen had trailed off the edge of the page. There were no more entries. The rest of the notebook was blank. I sat on the floor for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. I looked at the radiator, at the dark gap where the notebook had been hidden. Prewitt hadn't filed this in the station records. He had hidden it. He had hidden it because he knew he wasn't supposed to have it, or because he knew no one would believe it, or because he was afraid of what would happen if someone found it. I closed the notebook. I put it in my personal bag. I didn't turn it into the district. I didn't mention Prewitt's name in any official communication. Later that afternoon, I used the landline to call the district office. The coordinator, a woman named Hessel, answered. I kept my voice casual. I asked her how many rangers had been posted at Harrow Peak in the last 10 years. 3, including you, she said. You, Prewitt, and a guy named Miller before him. Did Prewitt transfer out? I asked. Prewitt left the service, she said. Her voice was flat, professional. Resigned, effective immediately. Cited personal reasons. Do you know where he went? The district doesn't track former employees forwarding addresses once they resign, Owen. You know that. Right. Sorry. Just making conversation. It's fine. How are things up at the peak? Quiet, I said. Cold, but quiet. I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the black notebook in my bag. Prewitt had left the service. He hadn't transferred. He had just stopped. He had seen something during the temperature drop. He had gone to the window. And then he had written one sentence and never written another word. I took out my physical logbook. I opened it to the current day. I picked up my pen. I didn't write about Prewitt. I didn't write about the notebook. I just wrote the weather data, the fuel levels, the gate status. I recorded only what I directly observed. I closed the book. The fourth rule broke the silence of the radio room. I had been at the station 3 months. The winter snows had started, dusting the lower elevations and capping the peak in white. The radio was my only connection to the outside world. I used it for the morning and evening weather check-ins with the district repeater. The protocol was strict. The district signs in with their call sign. District dispatch, this is Harrow Peak. I respond. Harrow Peak, go ahead. We exchange the data. We sign off. At 11:15 p.m. on a Wednesday in late November, the radio activated. I was in the kitchen, reading a paperback novel. The radio was on standby, the green light glowing in the dark. The squelch broke with a sharp hiss of static. I put my book down. I waited for the dispatcher to identify themselves. The static cleared. A voice came through the speaker. It was a man's voice. It was calm, conversational, and entirely unhurried. It didn't sound like a dispatcher. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. Owen, the voice said. Just my name. Not Harrow Peak Station. Not Unit 7. Just my first name. The tone was casual, the way you start a sentence when you're talking to a friend across a table. Owen, pass the salt. Owen, did you see that? I sat perfectly still. My hand was hovering over the microphone. If the radio produces a voice that does not identify itself with the correct district call sign, do not respond. Log the time and the content of the transmission if you can. Do not engage. I pulled my hand back. I reached for the logbook. I opened it. I wrote, 2,315 hours. Radio activation. Voice, male, no call sign. Content, first name only. The voice didn't say anything else. It didn't ask how I was. It didn't give me a weather report. It just said my name, and then the transmission ended. The squelch closed. The green standby light came back on. I sat in the kitchen for an hour, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the wind outside. The radio didn't activate again. In the morning, I called the district on the landline. I told the dispatcher I had experienced a possible radio anomaly the previous night, a stray transmission on the repeater frequency. I didn't mention the voice. I didn't mention my name. Probably just a skip, the dispatcher said. Temperature inversion bouncing a signal from down in the valley. Happens sometimes in the winter. Check your squelch settings. I'll do that, I said. I hung up. I checked the squelch settings. They were fine. I went back to the logbook. I didn't add anything to the entry. I just closed the book and went out to check the weather mast. The fifth rule came in my 10th week. It was a clear night in late November. No moon. The sky was a dense, black canopy scattered with stars. The cold was absolute, the kind of high-altitude cold that feels like a physical weight against the glass. I was in the kitchen, washing my dinner dishes. The station was dark, except for the single overhead light. I looked up, glancing out the north window toward the peak. The Harrow North Route is a permanently closed trail. It starts at the north boundary of the station clearing and climbs steeply up the scree slopes towards the summit. The trailhead is sealed with a heavy steel chain and a weathered wooden sign that reads, "Closed unstable terrain." No one goes up that trail. The terrain is too loose, the incline too severe, and in the winter, the avalanche risk is extreme. I was looking out the north window when I saw the light. It was on the Harrow North Route, about a quarter-mile up the slope, just above the tree line. It was a pale, steady, yellowish light. It wasn't flickering like a flashlight. It wasn't moving. It was just there, fixed in the darkness, glowing with a quiet, persistent intensity. I stopped washing the dishes. I held the plate in my hands, the soapy water dripping onto the floor. My first instinct was to get my heavy flashlight, go outside, and signal back. If someone was up on the closed trail, they were in extreme danger. They could be injured. They could be lost. It was my job to assist them. Then I remembered the rule. If you see a light on the Harrow North Route after dark, do not investigate. Do not use your own light to signal toward it. Confirm the trail gate is locked from the station window and stay inside. I set the plate in the sink. I wiped my hands on a towel. I walked to the north window, but I didn't look at the light. I angled my body so I was looking down at the trailhead, at the heavy chain and the wooden sign. From this angle, in the dark, I couldn't see the padlock clearly, but I could see the chain. It was pulled taut across the posts. The gate was closed. I stepped back from the window. I walked to the kitchen table and sat down. I kept my back to the north window. I didn't look at the light again. I sat there for 30 minutes, listening to the wind, listening to the silence of the station. When I finally stood up and looked out the window again, the light was gone. The slope was just black rock and white snow under the stars. I went to the logbook. I wrote, 20:45 hours. Possible light source on north closure. Origin undetermined. Duration approximately 30 minutes. Trail gate chain observed secure from interior. I didn't write that it looked like a lantern. I didn't write that it felt like it was waiting for me to signal back. I just wrote the facts. The sixth rule was the one that made me understand what Prewitt had been afraid of. It was a Friday night in early December. The snow was deep now, piled high against the utility porch. The wind was howling around the corners of the station, a high, thin whistle that never stopped. I was in the sleeping room, reading in bed. At 10:40 p.m., I heard the knock. 3 knocks, measured, unhurried. Knock, knock, knock. They came from the heavy wooden front door, through the kitchen, into the sleeping room. They were loud enough to cut through the sound of the wind. I lay still in bed. My heart was beating hard against my ribs. I waited, thinking maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was a branch hitting the door. Knock. 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 Same rhythm. Same force. I got out of bed. I pulled my boots on. I walked into the kitchen. I stood on the interior side of the heavy wooden door. I didn't unlock it. I didn't open it. "Who is it?" I called out. My voice sounded thin in the small room. "State your name and your emergency." There was a pause. The wind whistled outside. Then a voice answered. It was a man's voice. It was calm, slightly muffled by the thick wood of the door. "I was hiking the fire road," the voice said. "Got turned around in the dark. My truck is a few miles south. I just need to warm up for a few minutes and use the radio to call a tow." It was a perfectly reasonable request. It was exactly the kind of thing a lost hiker would say. "What is your name?" I asked. "David," the voice said. Quietly. The kind of name you give when you haven't rehearsed it. "What is your specific emergency, David?" I asked. "Are you injured? Are you experiencing hypothermia?" "I'm cold," the voice said. "Just let me in by the stove for a bit." I closed my eyes. I thought about the rule. If they cannot state a specific emergency, tell them to wait at the fire ring, and that you will assist them at first light. Do not open the door, regardless of what they say next. "You need to wait at the fire ring," I said, my voice steady. "I will come out and assist you at first light. Do not leave the ring." There was a long silence. The wind battered the walls. I stood with my hand on the deadbolt, my knuckles white. Then the voice spoke again. It was very quiet. It was right up against the wood of the door, as if the speaker's mouth was pressed directly against the gap. "Owen," the voice said, "it's cold out here." My blood turned to ice. He knew my name. The voice on the radio had known my name. The thing outside the door knew my name. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I stood in the kitchen, my hand on the deadbolt, and I listened. "Owen," the voice said again. It didn't sound angry. It didn't sound threatening. It just sounded patient. "Open the door, Owen." I didn't open the door. I didn't say a word. I stood there for 5 minutes. The wind howled. The wood stove ticked. Then I couldn't hear anything outside. The voice was gone. There were no footsteps walking away, no sound of a truck starting, just the wind. I stayed in the kitchen until dawn. I didn't sleep. When the sky turned gray, I unlocked the door and walked out onto the utility porch. I walked around to the front of the station. The snow was undisturbed. There were no footprints leading to the door. There were no footprints leading away. The snow in front of the door was a perfect, unbroken sheet of white. No one had stood there. No one had knocked. I walked over to the stone fire ring in the clearing south of the station. The snow inside the ring was undisturbed. No one had sat there. No one had waited. I went back inside. I locked the door. I made my coffee. I opened the logbook. I looked at the blank page. I didn't write about the knock. I didn't write about the voice. I didn't write that something outside the door knew my name. I just wrote the weather data. I recorded only what I directly observed, and what I directly observed was an empty yard. The seventh rule was the final test. It came 3 weeks before the end of my posting. I was in the kitchen. It was 12:15 a.m. The wood stove was banked, glowing a dull, steady orange. The temperature inside the station was a comfortable 68 degrees. I was sitting at the table, writing in the logbook. At 12:22 a.m., I saw my breath. It was a faint, thin cloud of white mist in the air in front of my face. I stopped writing. I looked at the wood stove. The coals were still glowing. I looked at the indoor thermometer on the kitchen wall. The needle was dropping. It wasn't a slow decline. It was a rapid, steady fall. 65, 62, 58. If the temperature inside the station drops more than 15 degrees in under 30 minutes after midnight, do not attempt to locate the source of the draft. Bank the stove, put on your gear, and sit in the center of the kitchen until the temperature stabilizes. Do not go to the windows. I stood up. I didn't look at the windows. I didn't try to feel for a draft. I walked to the wood stove and closed the air intake, banking the fire. I walked to the sleeping room and pulled on my insulated pants, my heavy wool sweater, my down jacket, my wool hat, and my insulated gloves. I walked back into the kitchen. The thermometer read 45 degrees. I could see defrost forming on the inside of the window glass. I walked to the center of the kitchen floor. There was a braided rug there, left by a previous ranger, a thick, heavy thing made of woven wool. I sat down in the center of the rug. I crossed my legs. I put my hands on my knees. I kept my back straight. I didn't look at the windows. I kept my eyes fixed on the wood stove. The temperature kept dropping. 40 degrees, 35, 32. The cold was absolute. It wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was a physical presence. It felt like the air itself was turning to ice. The frost on the windows thickened, creeping inward, covering the glass in opaque white. The metal of the wood stove groaned as it contracted. 28 degrees, 27. The thermometer stopped at 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside a sealed, insulated building with a banked wood stove in the middle of a winter night. I sat on the rug. I breathed slowly. I didn't shiver. I didn't move. I kept my eyes on the stove. I thought about Prewitt. I went to the window during the temperature drop, and I saw. I didn't go to the window. I sat on the rug. I sat there for 1 hour and 14 minutes. At 1:36 a.m., the thermometer began to rise. 28, 30, 35. The frost on the windows began to melt, turning to water and running down the glass in thick streaks. The air in the kitchen warmed. By 3:30 a.m., the temperature was back to 52 degrees. I stayed on the rug until 4 a.m. Then I stood up. My joints were stiff. My breath was still pluming in the air, but the room was warm again. I walked to the wood stove, opened the air intake, and added 3 logs. I watched them catch. I made a pot of coffee. I didn't look out the windows. I never looked out the windows during the temperature drop. I didn't know what Prewitt saw. I didn't want to know. I decided, sitting on that rug in the freezing dark, that not knowing was the version of this story I could live with. The 8th rule wasn't about a single incident. It was about all of them. In the morning log, record only what you directly observed. Do not record inferences, interpretations, or questions. If you are uncertain what you observed, write nothing and wait for clarity. The log is not a place for uncertainty. Over the course of 4 months, that rule changed the way my mind worked. I learned to write the logs with surgical restraint, time, location, observable fact. Nothing inferred, nothing felt, nothing feared. The discipline of it bled into everything else. I stopped asking the mountain what it was doing. I stopped trying to figure out the logic behind the rules. I just recorded what the mountain did, and I followed the rules, and I survived the night. It was the most useful thing the rules gave me. It was also the thing I am least sure was healthy. It requires a specific kind of mental fragmentation to look at a frost corridor that defies biology and write possible wildlife activity. It requires a deep, practiced dissociation to hear a voice use your name in the dark and write radio anomaly. But it kept me sane, or it kept me functional. I'm not sure there's a difference when you're living at 7,000 feet in a building that drops to 27 degrees for no reason. The 8th rule is the posture of a person who has decided to stay. It is the acceptance that you will never have all the answers, and that trying to find them will only get you killed. You just record the facts. You just do the job. You just wait for the sun to come up. My posting at Harrow Peak ended in late December. I packed my truck in the early morning. The sky was gray, the snow was falling in light, dry flakes, and the peak was hidden behind a veil of clouds. I drove down the 12-mile fire road, the tires crunching on the packed snow, the heater blowing warm air against my boots. I submitted my season reports at the district office. I didn't mention the frost corridor, or the locked gate, or the ghost gust, or the voice on the radio, or the light on the trail, or the knock at the door, or the temperature drop. I just submitted the weather data, the wildlife surveys, and the maintenance logs. Clean, professional, factual. I requested another posting in the same district. I got one 3 ranges south, a lower elevation, a quieter station. I've been there 2 years now. It's quieter, but it's not entirely quiet. And I've started noticing things at dusk that I didn't notice in my first posting, before Harrow Peak calibrated my attention. A shadow that moves against the wind. A silence that falls too fast. A feeling of being watched from the tree line. Last week, a new ranger arrived at my station. He's young, capable, with the same focused competence I remember in myself. He's eager to do the job. He wants to know the protocols. On his first night, I sat across the kitchen table from him. I had the list, not the original. I never had the original, but my own reconstruction, written out during that first season as each rule proved itself. I had it folded in my shirt pocket. I held the paper under the table. I thought about Ket, reading from the folded sheet without looking up. I thought about Prewitt's notebook, the sentence that stopped. I thought about what it means to give someone a set of rules and send them into a mountain night alone. I didn't read the list. I folded it tighter, put it back in my pocket, and told the new ranger about the fire road gates, the radio schedule, the weather mast, the propane check. I told him the ordinary things. I told him the things that were in the manual. I told myself I would see how the first few weeks went. I told myself I would know when the time was right. I haven't decided if I will ever read the list to him. I am telling you this story to figure out if silence is protection or abandonment. I don't have an answer yet. It is early morning now. I am at my current station, standing at the kitchen window, making coffee before dawn. The mountains outside are just beginning to take shape in the pre-dawn light. The peaks moving from black to gray to the first cold suggestion of color. I have followed the rules for years now, not just the 8 from Harrow Peak, but the ones I've written since, the ones that each new posting teaches me. The mountains at night are not malicious. I don't believe that anymore. I believe they are what they are, old, complex, operating on terms established long before the Forest Service existed, long before people started building wooden boxes in the trees and calling them stations. The rules are simply a way of coexisting with terms you didn't set. That is most of what the job has ever been. I fold my list and put it in my shirt pocket, where Ket used to keep his. The new ranger is still asleep in the back room. I have until breakfast to decide if I'm going to wake him up and read it to him. The mountains outside are beautiful. The light is hitting the snow, turning it a pale, bruised purple, just like it did at Harrow Peak. I have never stopped thinking they are beautiful. I look at them every day, and every day they take my breath away. And I still don't know if that is wisdom or if it is the most dangerous thing about me. I pick up my mug. I turn away from the window. I go to wake the new ranger.